April 26th off as a holiday. And so I was very pleased with all that. And then I found out it was because of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I thought for many years it was just a prophetic celebration of my birthday. But anyway, the Augustinians have a great devotion to the Mother of Good Counsel. She's a patroness of the order. And this is her feast. The Mother of Good Counsel in Italy, a village, was having very terrible problems in the 12th century. And they had an image appear just hanging in space. And the image was a painting of Our Lady holding Jesus. And the title of the painting was The Mother of Good Counsel. They built a church around it, and according to legend, I've never seen it, but according to legend, the picture still hangs independently of the church. The church is built around the building. But anyway, Augustinians were put in charge of it, and it is their patroness. So there's more than one reason to celebrate today. What I would like to do, because of the way we've covered basically what I wanted to do with regards to the texts. So what I'm going to go through today are basically the text that comes from the office for the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. The Exaltation of the Holy Cross occurs on September 14th, and that is the date on which St. Helena found that cache of crosses that they used to determine. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Jerusalem, but many people who go to Jerusalem never see the spot where the discovery took place. If you go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is a door you can go down, and you drop about 3 floors. It's a very long staircase. And at the end of the staircase, you have a large chapel. And at the side of that, there's another floor you go down. And at the bottom of that's just a small cave. And it is where they found all the crosses. It was the dump that was used underneath. Okay? Having said that, I'm going to begin in Galatians chapter 2 with verse 19. Okay? And this is Paul. In fact, through the law, I am dead to the law, so that I can prove that I was wrong before, so that I can be alive to God. Okay? So through the law, I'm dead to the law, so I can be alive to God. What Paul is talking about is this relationship with Jesus. Before God walked the face of the earth, the most you and I could know is what God really wanted us to know that was revealed through the sacred texts. But one of the curious things, I don't know how many of you have this experience. If you've ever read a book of instructions that comes with a computer or a clock. Actually, they have them with shoes today. But I mean, you get these, the lawyers make them write them. Anyone who could actually get through that probably needs an engineering degree in the first place. But the fact of the matter is, you can read one of those things 4 or 5 times, and until you have someone sit beside you and do it, you really have no idea what's going on. And it's for thousands of years before Jesus Christ walked the face of the earth, the most we had was God's instruction book. And with God's instruction book, oftentimes you end up with serious conflicts. A serious conflict in God's instruction book is you have to observe the Sabbath by not working. And simultaneously, what happens if someone is in desperate need of you doing some work on the Sabbath? Or they will die. Okay, what are you supposed to do? Well, you know, for you and I, that's a moot question. And the reason it's a moot question is because you and I have watched Jesus live God's law. And we have no doubt he'd skip the church and take care of the person who's dying. We would all know that. It wouldn't even occur to us as a conflict. But the reason is because you and I have come to this relationship with Jesus and have actually watched Jesus live God's law. The thing is that many people observe God's law. Even after they watch Jesus, they observe God's law, in such a way that they sometimes mitigate their relationship with Jesus. It's almost as though they really want to follow Jesus perfectly, but they just don't want to step off that other thing. And I'll tell you, a place I see it all the time is in the Sacrament of Reconciliation. I'll be going through the Sacrament of Reconciliation, and someone will say, and I want to confess missing Mass. And whenever there's a long period in reconciliation and someone confesses missing one Mass, usually there's a very good reason. If someone has a long period and they've missed all the Masses, then even if they give you a reason, it's fallacious, okay? But a lot of people, if they're in the habit of regularly going and they miss one, they usually have a good excuse, okay? If they're in the habit of not going and they miss one, they usually don't have a good excuse. It's a basic premise about everything. It's like if you ever have a friend of yours who's always late for everything, they will always have an excuse. It's fallacious. They're late. That's what they do for a living, okay? They're late. Know that when you ask them, okay? That's just the nature of the thing. When I first arrived in the Diocese of San Diego in the seminary, I was made the Master of Ceremonies for the Bishop Buddy. And one of the things that people thought was phenomenal while I was there, I was the only time there was an MC in the diocese where Bishop Buddy was on time for everything. But what they didn't notice is that when Bishop Buddy was on time for everything, he always apologized for being late at the beginning. And the reason is, I always told him everything started 15 minutes earlier than it did. And so he would always arrive there just on time, then apologize for being late, you know? No one knew what he was talking about. And I wasn't about to tell them. But anyway, you have people come into the Sacrament of Reconciliation, they'll say, I missed Mass on Sunday. And I say, why? And they say, well, my husband had surgery last weekend, and I really did not want to leave him at home alone for that time. And I said, well, you know that really isn't a sin. Well, she says, well, I probably could have gone. After it's only an hour. And I said, you honestly think there's a sin? Well, she says, oh, no, I know it's a sin. I know it's not a sin. I just need to confess it. Do you realize that's a person who is not refusing to step off the law? What they're doing is absolutely right, and they know it's right. But somehow this thing of the law just picks at them. And we need to know that you and I enter into this relationship with Jesus Christ. When we come to God for final judgment, the great danger of intellectuals is that they think final judgment is going to be a written exam. It's not, you know? You can know all the theology in the world, and if you want to, you can teach it in hell, okay? That is not salvation, okay? And the second thing is legalists. They think they're coming in front of a lawyer, and you aren't. You're coming in front of a God who is looking for a reason to get you into heaven. And all of us are looking through our lives trying to find, can he have any reason here to get us to hell? We need to cover all these reasons. You know, that's not what he's looking for. He's looking for a reason to bring you into heaven. You don't need to worry about that sort of thing. So what Paul is saying is, we need to live to God, but in order to live to God, we need to die to the law. And I think people have a fear that if I follow Jesus very carefully, I may on occasion break the law. You cannot. You cannot break the law following Jesus Christ. And so you and I make this real commitment. The purpose of law, I've probably given you this analogy before, but the purpose of law is to give you freedom. And if I were to use the example, when I was in San Diego as a youngster, the tallest building in all of San Diego was the YMCA that was built for the military. There's a military YMCA in downtown San Diego. I think it's 7 stories. On the top story, believe it or not, it's a volleyball court. Okay? The top story is a volleyball court. And as you can imagine, there's a very high fence around it. Okay? But can you imagine what volleyball would be up there if you didn't have a fence? You would stay very close to the center of the net. And if the ball went over your head, too bad for the ball, period. You would stay there. There would be very little running and absolutely no jumping, okay? And so you'd be very cautious. Well, see, that's what law is. Law gives us a very clear line. They have a very high fence that goes clear around the building. You can run after any ball you want because you'll run into the fence, okay? You can play the game fine up there. The fence is what saves you. And that's what law is supposed to do. A law, it provides us with a perimeter. And so that while we're living our lives, if we find ourselves up against the law, that's where we need to stop. And I'll give you an example of the hippie thing. The hippie thing is you're supposed to do the loving thing for everyone. What if the loving thing is the person wants to commit adultery with you? Well, that's the law. The law is right there. The law is very clear, okay? But in your relationships, ordinarily, you don't have to worry about the law until that comes up, okay? But what God does is give us this freedom. And a lot of people spend their lives walking along the edge of the fence. They're living by the law. And the law is just supposed to provide a freedom. You and I are supposed to live in the center and enjoy it. And if you get close, you bounce off. You know the law. You know, you don't have to be an idiot, you know. I can get angry with you. I can be unhappy with you. I can sulk about you. When I decide to kill you, I've hit the wall, okay? You don't do that. Don't do that. Go home and sulk some more, okay? Don't hit the wall, okay? And so we're supposed to do that. And he says, I have been crucified with Jesus, yet I'm alive. Yet it is no longer I, but Christ living in me. And what he's saying is that in Jesus, when Jesus went through the crucifixion, you and I know that Jesus was both God and a human being. But the interesting thing is, the day before Jesus was buried, it is very difficult to realize he is God when you walk him walking the face of the earth. It's very difficult to realize that man who's the carpenter, the man who gets tired, the man who gets hungry, the man who bleeds. It's very difficult to remember that man is God, but he is. The day after the resurrection, it's hard to remember that's a human being. This is a guy who's walking through walls. This is a guy who's creating fish. This is a guy who's, it's very difficult to believe he's a human being. But you know, Jesus was a human being his whole life. And Jesus is God all the time. It's just the thing of the realization. And the same thing, you and I, we're human beings, and we're in a communion with God. And as we die to ourselves in the crucifixion of Jesus, the divinity should be more and more visible in us. And the divinity is that you and I are not locked into all this law. We are locked into Christ Jesus, which is freedom and this power. He says, the life that I am now living, subject to the limits of human nature, I'm living in faith. Faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So he says, I live with a human nature. I can't escape this body and everything, so I live with this human nature. But simultaneously, the basis of what this nature is on faith. You know, in human life, we go through a gradual transition from faith to knowledge. What you know and what you believe are two different things. You don't believe anything you know, and you don't know anything you believe. Okay, that's why in heaven there is no faith. You'll know everything. Once you know something, you don't believe it, okay? But you know, the process of being a human being is to begin with nothing but faith. And so you're a little tiny baby, and your mother says, this is good for you. And you believe her. Your mother says, you don't eat that. You believe her. Mother says, you don't play in the street. You believe her. And you know, as you get older and older, you learn more and more about those things. My mother told me not to touch the stove because it's hot, so I didn't for many years. I believed her. And then I reached a point in my life where I no longer believed her. It's because I'd touched the stove. I knew it was hot. From then on, I knew, okay? But in human life, you and I go through this ongoing transition from belief to knowledge. And the older you are, the more you know. I'm not saying you can remember it, but you know it, okay? The older you are, the more you know. But the more you know, the less you believe, okay? But understand, one of the real limits of human life is people who live their lives just on their knowledge. Okay? An example of that in the scriptures, if I can't put my hand in his side, if I can't put my fingers in, he had to know it. And so Jesus says, blessed are those who believe and have never seen. Okay? So you and I want in our lives to live our lives more and more in the realm of faith. Live our lives more and more in the realm of faith, until one day you and I actually realize what we believe is stronger, more important, more influential than everything we will ever know. Do you know that in my knowledge in theology, I study a lot about God. I know an immense amount about God. But you know, in my faith, I touch the real God. I believe in the God who really is. I can reason to the God I've understood from a bunch of different theologians. But the God I know is the theories. The God I believe is a living God who created the entire universe. That's the God I believe. And our faith, we oftentimes think of our faith as weaker things. Our faith is the strongest thing in this universe. Our faith raised all of creation. Our faith allows you and I to walk into a little tiny room, hear a few words, and walk out knowing all our sins are gone. Our faith allows each one of us, privately and as a community, to actually enter into communion with the very God of the universe. It's just amazing what our faith does, the door of faith. He says, I am not setting aside God's grace as if it has no value. It is merely that if saving justice comes through the law, then Jesus died needlessly. Okay, he says to understand that this idea of what goes on in faith, that you and I are called to this powerful life of faith. And Jesus on the cross showed us that basically everything we know can perish, and everything we believe will live forever. I had an experience one time in the parish after I broke my arm. I broke my shoulder. I had a very serious accident one time. And 2 weeks later, I'm the only priest in the parish, so that it's really important that I'm there. So about 2 weeks later, I was celebrating the liturgy, and I had to have 2 deacons with me because I was very unstable physically. And so the deacons were basically moving me around. And one of the things that took place was a baptism at the service. And did I tell you this story at all about the baptism? So the baptism took place at the service. It's a smaller parish, and so what we do is, if you want a baptism, you tell us whether or not you want it during a Mass. If you want it during a Mass, then we schedule it during one of the Masses. And if you don't want it during a Mass, you can have it any time of the day or night you want. We just, set it up for you. So anyway, this was during the Mass, and I'm having real trouble as far as moving and all this sort of thing. And I have almost like this vision, and I see this baby being held basically within the I guess I would say the confines of hell. And I see all these demons and everything moving around, and like they're salivating as they're looking at the baby and everything. And I began the baptism. I think the first part of the baptism is an exorcism. And in doing the exorcism, I watched this sort of stuff recede. And I pour the water, and it sort of all disappears around. It's kind of gone. And as I'm going up to the altar, because I'm having real struggle getting up the altar, I just kind of say in exasperation to God, I say, I'm so weak. And I can literally feel God's hand on my cheek, and he says, but strong enough. It's something to remember about our faith, that you see these people, elderly people working in the church and everything. What you're looking at is the power of God operating through a person. And never be deceived by all the other stuff. Because you and I may hobble along, you and I may have trouble speaking, you and I may have all these things going on, but I want you to know that every demon in hell trembles with every breath we take. The power that operates in faith is unbelievable. And you may not understand it, but trust me, there are powers around you that do. You need to always understand this is what we are. We walk in this faith. And Paul goes on, he says, you stupid people in Galatia. Thank God all the stupid people are in Galatia. He says, after you had a clear picture of Jesus Christ crucified right in front of your eyes, who has put a spell on you? And he's saying, right before you, you had the image of Jesus crucified. Now, is he talking about a picture of the crucifixion? He's talking about himself. Paul is the one who came before them as a man who was broken, and all these things. And Paul came into their community. He says, you had in front of you the image of Jesus crucified and seen the power. Now, remember we talked about this with the crucifixion. It wasn't at the resurrection that the great power began to flow. It was at the death on the cross itself that we see these people converted for thing. And he says, you saw this very thing. And to come to this, some sense of the unbelievable power that dwells in us simply because we are crucified in Christ Jesus. We're free from the law by his teaching. We're free from weakness by his power. We're free from all these things because of this relationship to Jesus. But what needs to be maintained is the closeness to Jesus. Okay? It is the closeness to Jesus Christ. And so he says, who put a spell on you? And what's going on here? I think the thing he's dealing with here is called the Judaizers. And the Judaizers are the people who insisted that you would become a Christian and follow Jesus, but you really needed to be circumcised. And you would become a Christian and follow Jesus, but you really needed to avoid pork. And you would become a Christian and follow Jesus, but you couldn't violate any of the kosher laws. And so they wanted you to be a Christian and follow Jesus, but not give up the constraints of the law. And so what he's talking about here is he says, who put a spell on you to go back to that after you got the freedom? He says, there is one thing I would like you to tell me. How is it that you received the Spirit? Was it by the practice of the law or by believing in the message you heard? Okay? Now he's talking particularly to Gentiles. Okay? Remember this whole thing of the circumcision and stuff, you don't need to impose that on Jews. Jews who come in are already circumcised, already following the law, and all that isn't the issue. So the people here are trying to impose it on Gentiles who are converting. So he says, you Gentiles, where did you get the Spirit? Did you get the Spirit from the law? That never had anything to do with the law at all. He says, you got the Spirit through the power of your faith. If you got the Spirit through the power of your faith, why do you return to the law? Okay? What's the use of going back to the law? It's sort of like if you have something in your system, like for instance, when I had if I were to take the bladder cancer, that people tell you, I don't know if other people have this sort of thing, but I found it highly amusing. I never quite, kind of gone through that before. But once you get something like bladder cancer, do you know that everyone on the face of the earth knows a cure? They really do, I'm really surprised we have medicine. But anyway, I was told that if you stop drinking tea, it'll go away. I was told if you start drinking tea, it'll go away. I was told that if you stick to green tea, it'll go away. I was told if you stick to black tea, it'll go away. Then I could go into the area of alcohols. Then I could go into the area of, just endlessly. Everyone I met actually knew how to cure it. I was surprised anyone had it. But they would constantly go through all these different things. And the fact of the matter is, if the doctor removes the tumors, who cares about all those things anyway? It's gone, What's the big deal? And so Jesus is saying to the Gentiles, he says, you had all these different things about where you're supposed to get power in your life. Where did you get it? You got it when you believed in Jesus Christ. And now you're going back to that garbage afterwards? Skip it. This is where you got the power. Live this power. He says, having begun in the Spirit, can you be so stupid as to end in the flesh? Okay? As I told you, if you ever get a letter from Paul, don't open it. Okay? So, anyway, Paul's telling them that something that begins in this way cannot be completed in another way. And I guess if I were to use the example, do you remember the story in the book of Daniel about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw? Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue, and it was a glorious statue, and the head was all of gold, and the body was all of silver. The legs were of carnelian. The feet, the ankles were of iron. The upper part of the feet were of iron mixed with clay, and the feet at the bottom were clay. Ever hear that story? Okay, well, it's a vision that comes to Daniel, in the book of Daniel. And we get a saying in English from it, feet of clay, okay? And the idea is he's looking at this glorious statue, and this little rock begins to roll down from the hill, and this little rock hits the foot, shatters it. The entire statue is glorious as blunk, okay? And the thing is, you can't build a statue out of gold and complete it with clay. You can't do it, okay? And many people have this great power in the beginning of their lives in the Spirit, and then try and complete it with legalism. You know, I think that's one of the things going on in the Catholic Church today after Vatican II. That the great power and freedom that was found in Vatican II, now I notice people all going back to different things way in the past. And it's as though we began it this way, and now we have to, and the whole thing was the freedom and the power of the Spirit. I personally, just as a sideline, when I was praying about it one time, I felt God lead me to a particular passage. And it's a passage in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus, the Jews are have just left Egypt. Having left Egypt, God's about to lead them into the promised land. And so he sends 3 men into the promised land. The only one worth remembering is Caleb. But anyway, he sends 3 of them into the promised land. And in the promised land, they pick up the produce. If you ever go to Israel, the symbol today of the tourism department is 2 men holding a pole with grapes on it. Okay, they're the first tourists to Israel, actually. And that's the men from this expedition. So they come back with the stuff from the land, and it's all wonderful stuff that they find in the land. And then they begin to say, but the people there are very strong, and the people are very powerful. Now, if you remember, they're talking to the Jews that these people are very powerful, and the Jews have just walked out of the most powerful country in the entire world, Egypt. You know, so I don't care how powerful they are, they couldn't beat the Egyptians, and the Jews already had. And they come in, but they gradually make the people so frightened. It says the leaders of the people decide that they're frightened to go in the Holy Land. And so what God does, he says, all right. He says, I'll have you wander in the desert for 40 years, and then all the people, with the exception of Caleb, Joshua, and Moses, who advocated for the going into the Holy Land, with the exception of those 3, you'll all be dead. And your children will be delighted to go in the Holy Land. And so after that, they beg God to let them go into the Holy Land. He says, no, 40 years in the desert. So they start to go in on their own, and they're killed. And so the rest of them go out in the desert, and they wait the 40 years. See, I think that's what happened at the Vatican Council. The Vatican Council, God showed us the church of possibility. He showed us what he really was about with regards to the church. And the main thing that he was about was collegiality. That he wanted collegiality. That people should more recognize the fact of everyone's role and we shouldn't have this hierarchy set up. And so the bishops thought collegiality was the most wonderful thing in the entire world, because if we had collegiality, the Pope would have to listen to them. So the bishops passed it immediately, okay? And the Pope was less than enthusiastic, but, had the council, so he agreed to it. The bishops went back to their diocese and discovered there's another aspect of collegiality they hadn't thought of. They have to listen to their priests. And priests thought this was absolutely wonderful. But there is an aspect of collegiality where priests are supposed to listen to their congregations. That sucks. So anyway, as we look at this structure, every single level ignored what God was offering them above and got terrified at what was below. So they stepped back. And I think God is looking at the church now saying, all right, have another generation of the Latin and we'll try again. Okay? And he's saying, just wait. The people who were frightened of it, we'll all die. Try it with another generation. But the idea is this offering that God offers us. It's this, I think of it oftentimes with regards to college. If I don't know how many here went to college, but if you remember when you went to college, your parents take you to the college, and you get out of the car with your two suitcases, and you dutifully weep with your mother and kiss your father, and they get in the car, and you turn around, you pick up your two suitcases, and in your heart you say, thank God, and you go into the college, and it is the whole idea of the freedom. Now, there are a lot of problems and everything you'll find with freedom. As soon as you're on your own, you discover a whole bunch of problems, but you don't go home. Because with freedom, there's a whole bunch of other things that come too. It's a whole different thing. And we have to understand that is the wonderful thing of the Spirit. We have received the Spirit. It is something that has begun in this great power of the Spirit, and the idiocy to slip back into the restrictions of the law, okay? Because it's safe. Is it safe? No. He says, can all the favors you have received have had no effect at all if there really has been no effect? So he says, if you really don't live under the Spirit, then maybe all these gifts you received just didn't have an effect on you at all, that you really did not receive the gift of the Spirit. Okay? I think one of the amazing things of being a human being is to learn in your life to recognize the gifts you have received. And that is one of the most important things to do to people around you, is make people aware of their giftedness. If you watch Jesus Christ will do that through the gospel accounts. He will consistently recognize the gift of a person and refuse to let them ignore it. So he'll go up to someone like Simon Peter with his background, and he'll say, I will make you a fisher of people. And then by the time we reach the Acts of the Apostles, do you know if Simon Peter's name were not the same, you would not identify the Simon Peter of the Acts of the Apostles with the Simon Peter of the gospel accounts. There is no relationship between the two. You watch what he makes of these people. Mary Magdalene, someone very much on the edge, a peripheral person because of her background and all that sort of thing. And by the time the scriptures end, she's the first woman to see Jesus raised from the dead. I should say the first person. She's the first person to see Jesus raised from the dead. And she's called in the Eastern Church the apostle to the apostles. She was the one sent to the apostles with the announcement of the resurrection. And you watch what Jesus does. Jesus looks at a person and he refuses to let them be anything else and gradually brings them forward. If you're interested, there's an American musical that has that as its theme, and the musical is Man of La Mancha. If you ever see Man of La Mancha, Don Quixote, who everyone thinks is crazy, will look at a person and decide what they're supposed to be. There's the local town prostitute, and he decides she's the virginal maiden for which he is out jousting, with the enemy. And she constantly, tries to confront him with reality, and he constantly confronts her with his dream. The little guy who supports him is a barber, And he convinces him he is the squire to a knight and all this sort of thing. And, well, I'm just a barber. Well, I'm just this. This is my barber bowl. It is your helmet. And it goes through this whole thing. And the interesting thing is, on his deathbed, as Don Quixote is dying, everyone around the deathbed realizes it's better to live his dream than their reality. And so they do. They become who he made. That's exactly what Jesus did. That's exactly what Jesus did. He confronted people and he showed them his dream of who they are. And eventually, you discover that Jesus' dream of who you are is a lot more fun than what has passed in your mind for reality. I think it's part of one of the things the world does to us. When you study little kids, because of the type of fairy tales and everything, every kid imagines themselves to be a little prince or princess, and they haven't been discovered yet. People don't know, and then you build up all this sort of thing. And then we begin to study, in college. You begin to realize you really aren't the brightest person in the class, certainly not the best looking. You go through this whole list of things, and you're convinced of them. But when you get deep into the study of theology, you discover you were right at the beginning. You are a prince. You are a princess. You do have a kingdom. You haven't discovered it yet. That is fact. And I think oftentimes we allow the world to erode the reality that was in our hearts at the beginning. But if you let him, Jesus Christ will activate that reality. The lie that the world has told you about who you are, he is delighted to smash that. Just delighted. And if you ever let him smash it in your life, I'll tell you one thing, you'll spend the rest of your life beating it out of other people. That's the amazing thing. You will never let anyone else settle for what the world has told them they are. You will never allow that once you actually break out of it yourself. He says, would you say then that he who so lavishly sends the Spirit to you and causes miracles among you is doing this through your practice of the law or because of your faith? He says, why do you think Jesus is acting on you? Think Jesus is acting on you because of the law? Yeah. He's acting upon you because of the power of faith he's put within you. And having put that power of faith within you, if it was the law, he doesn't need to act on you. You have the law. But if you've decided to live apart from the law, Jesus really needs to show you what to do. And so he does that because you are living apart from the law. In other words, if I were to take the example of, we have an excellent cook in our area, and I really enjoy his company because I like to eat. And but this guy is hired to train chefs in big restaurants and this sort of thing. And when I come over, he will open up a recipe as to what he's doing, and the recipe is sitting right there. And while the recipe is sitting there, he'll tell me different things to do, and so I'll do the things as he tells me. Do you realize how stupid it would be for me when he tells me something to then look at it in the recipe? Because if the recipe said something different, I wouldn't be doing it anyway. I'd do what he said. He's the guy who writes these recipes, But he'll say to me about putting one of the things he told me the other day, he has a recipe, a very simple recipe for asparagus, where you cut the asparagus into small pieces and saute it with onions and garlic, and then you mix it with penne pasta and put Parmesan on it. But anyway, he told me, he says, the way you do it is, he says, remember you have to fast until Mass. Okay? He says you cut the asparagus like this, and he says take the first group of asparagus, you put it in, you count to 5. Then take the second group, put it in, count to 5. And so it sounded stupid to me, but I did it, and we could all finish. And when the thing was over, I said, why did I count to 5? He says, because one end of the asparagus is thicker than the other end. And he says, if you count to 5 with each group as you do it, that all cooks together, you know? And this whole idea that if he says to do it, I do it. If I'm going to ask questions, I do it later. I never look at the recipe thing. And Jesus is saying, you know, if I'm telling you what to do, why do you look at the law? You know, think I'm going to break the law? Think I'm going to do something stupid? You know? No. We're called to this kind of thing of believing. He says, Abraham, you remember, put his faith in God, and this was reckoned to him as righteousness. See, our righteousness is based not on obedience. Our righteousness is based on faith. We believe in Christ Jesus. We unite ourselves to Christ Jesus. We share in Christ Jesus' victory. We share in his power. We share in his resurrection. We are not united to the law. Okay? And as I mentioned, I think, you know, that law is sort of this protection. I go to the recipe thing again. You know, if you start cooking, you follow recipes slavishly. That's the way you begin cooking. And then the longer you're cooking, the less you follow recipes, because you know more of the thing that goes on and this sort of stuff. Okay? He says, be sure then that it is the people of faith who are the children of Abraham. What Paul is talking about here is the Jews, or the Judaizers, who are trying to get the Gentiles to follow the Jewish law, are constantly pointing out the children of Abraham follow these laws. And what Paul is saying, no. He says the children of Abraham, in fact, are the people who believed. Because Abraham believed what God said. That's what made Abraham who Abraham was. And so this call and the whole thing is that you and I should recognize in the cross of Jesus Christ, certainly the crucifixion of Jesus, and certainly our resurrection, but it's also the death to a whole other kind of life, as it was for Jesus. The Jesus who walked the face of the earth after the resurrection did not walk the face of the earth in the same way that the Jesus walked before the death. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but just as a point, do you know that there is not a single person who sees Jesus after the resurrection who didn't believe in him beforehand? If you did not believe in Jesus before the death, you did not see him physically after the resurrection. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is God does not want to force faith on anyone. You must first of all believe. Once you believe, then you can see and know all these things, okay? And it's interesting, if you study the lives of saints, you know, the great and wonderful things that happened in lives of saints, the stigmata in Padre Pio and stuff like that, you know, these wonderful things don't happen until after they believe. Because if God did this before they believed, he would be forcing faith. So to understand what this cross is for us, I'd like to close, as I mentioned, with the reading from the office. And this is the office, the priest says, and this is for the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, September 14th. See if I can find out who wrote this. This is by Andrew of Crete. Andrew of Crete's a bishop, probably about the 7th century. He says, had there been no cross, Christ could not have been crucified. Had there been no cross, life could not have been nailed to the tree. And if it had not been nailed, there would have been no streams of immortality pouring out of his side, blood and water for our cleansing. The legal bond of our sin would not be canceled. We would not have obtained our freedom. We would not enjoy the fruit of the tree of life. The gates of paradise would not stand open. Had there been no cross, death would not have been downtrodden, nor hell despoiled. Therefore, the cross is something wonderfully great and honorable. It is great because through the cross, the many noble acts of Christ found their fullness, and very many indeed, for both his miracles and his sufferings were rewarded with victory. The cross is honorable because it's both a sign of God's suffering, and at the same time it is his trophy of victory. It stands for his suffering because on it he freely suffered death, but it is his trophy because it is by the means by which the devil was wounded and death conquered. The very gates of hell were smashed, and the cross has become the one common salvation for every one of us who breathe, on the face of this earth. Thank you very much.
Kiss your head.